Now, one final section on getting a roof over your head. We'll walk through each of the examples of getting a roof over your head, but you should know that Project 5 breaks down kind of the rent versus buy and what a mortgage is like. And we'll reiterate a lot of the lessons that we learned today. But that's not until Project 5 in the next section. So what are your options? Well, generally there's 6 options of buy, long-term rent, short-term rent or temporary rent, friends and family, couch surfing, vehicles, and the street. I try not to be judgmental, but let's shoot to avoid that last one when possible. So I've included some great resources, including video, article, quiz, etc., that should help you in the links below as far as buying a home on should you buy or should you rent, and how do you know. And it comes down to the pros and cons and what your goals are. The number one, the primary factor of determining whether you should buy or rent is generally how long you're going to stay. That's kind of the number one most important variable when you're addressing the pros and cons. But in the United States, the majority of people choose to own. It's around 70%, slightly bounces between a little bit below that and the high 60s. But one of the main takeaways from buying is that you should know from the articles below, better understand what a down payment is and saving for that and providing that, and when a smaller down payment can be an option. And the other item to be aware of is that when you're evaluating rent versus buy, you could do something else with that down payment. So to calculate the true opportunity cost of owning a home, you need to consider what you could have done with that down payment. Again, that's all in the information below. We'll briefly walk through those pros and cons. First is the stability. You're not going to get kicked out of your home because it's sold to somebody else or your apartment or whatever it may be. You do get to change whatever you want if you care a lot about that. And it can be a financial plus depending on the circumstances. Lastly, one of the benefits of buying a home is that it can trick yourself into saving more money than you think, because you're paying down that principal on your, assuming you have a mortgage, you're paying down the principal on your mortgage every single month, and it's an indirect form of savings, and it can convince people to save more money than they otherwise would. On the downside, there is this higher risk, partially because it's, who fixes everything if something breaks? Well, that's you. But second, this is an undiversified asset. If you calculate your net worth, what percentage of that is the value of your home? If that's a very high number, that's a large amount of volatility that you're exposing your net worth to, which could be a downside or not, depending on your circumstances. Last, inflexibility to move to a newer job. If you lose your job or want to leave your job, it's generally easier to just pick up and move if you're renting rather than buying. Last, so people will sometimes say that you should, pay your rent to yourself, so you should always buy. That's not exactly the case. You should just do the analysis instead of just say always buy. Often it's much better to rent. Other times it's much better to buy. And there's also situations in the middle where it just comes down to your personal preferences. So stop and do the analysis. Just don't do one automatically rather than the other. Long-term rent or contract rent is the second most popular option for housing. And one of the biggest problems is that people look at the monthly rate instead of the annual rate. So instead of thinking $1,000 per month, think of $12,000 per year. So when you're evaluating two different options, you could say, well, this is $10,000 a year, and this is $12,000 a year, and I'm signing, say, a 12-month agreement. The difference is $2,000. Is $2,000 for that year worth it for you for one place versus the other place? And if you start thinking in this way, often you can become more satisfied with your choice because you've thought through it and you've thought through the alternatives. One of the largest pros, of course, is with lower risk. So it's kind of the opposite of the cons that we had just before. So someone else fixes your stuff when it breaks. And if you find a better job, maybe you move, or if you want to move closer to your work, that's maybe easier to do. It can also take less of your time because someone else is worrying about this other stuff that you don't need to worry about. Then the area of temporary rent. And there can be some relatively low-cost options that do not require a contract or run on a shorter-term basis. Generally, it's a little bit more expensive than contract rent, but not a lot more if you do your homework and find the right place. This is common in larger cities, especially because of things like Airbnb that are out there that provide not just short-term stay, but intermediate term stay, 90 days, let's say. That's possible because of it. And the primary benefit of temporary rent is to maximize your flexibility if that's what you're shooting for. Now for non-fixed housing, thanks to Silicon Valley hipsters over the last 10 to 15 years, this has become more normal. So one of my favorite quotes I remember from the recession of 2009 was, "The economic downturn has really increased interest in my lifestyle." I remember chuckling when I saw that. But this is something that, contrary to perhaps what it looks like, it takes a lot of work. And the main work that you have to deal with is managing your costs and your conveniences in a cost-effective way and in a way that doesn't just make your life miserable. Now, I had the privilege of interviewing a few people who have lived in their vehicles at different places in the United States with some experienced veterans. And what I saw was kind of three key insights that they all hit on. The first was to make a plan. To make a plan from the very get-go. It is harder than you think to do this. And so go through all of your routines. How is this going to work? And the second item was to, as part of making this plan, is to identify the availability of the key resources. So showering, food, restroom, warmth, cooling. And so if you don't actually work through this, you kind of just end up being a homeless person and not just a person who lives in a vehicle. It's also gotten people killed because of, say, carbon monoxide poisoning or something similar because they didn't make the right preparations for these critical areas. The last item, and the very last item after you've executed all of this, is to get a vehicle suitable for your plan. And once you've gone through all of this, interviewing these people who've gone through this process, is that they said that by planning things correctly, they ended up saving between $1,000 and $2,000 a month, or between, say, $12,000 and $25,000 a year. Now, for them, some of them were very happy about the situation and the decision, and some were not so happy about how it went down, despite the money that they saved, that it was not worth it. So, again, it's evaluating for your situation. We're going to wrap up section 4 with just a few items on utilities, which is kind of the last major expense we haven't hit on. Now, if you want to start down the path of saving money on utilities, I mean, the trite advice is just to act more like your grandparents. Because once upon a time, utilities were much more expensive, and your grandparents didn't want to waste money on those. So your grandparents, your parents' grandparents, great-grandparents, they probably have it down on saving money in these areas. But the first one would say be heating, which can be very expensive in some places. And it's also one of the drawbacks of, say, a larger home or larger apartment, is that it can lead to larger utility bills. The second item would be electricity, and it's kind of the same, in the same boat as heating. But the price of electricity can actually vary quite a bit depending on where you live. It can be very expensive in some places. Again, it's a drawback of a larger home. It leads to larger utility bills. And there are a variety of ways in order to contain those heating and electric bills. As far as your phone options, instead of just going with the default and going with the flow, make sure to evaluate your options every once in a while with phones. Read the fine print on contracts and have an idea of your fixed costs and variable costs. I'm just going to walk through a couple things here. There are phone carriers that will take into account how much you're using, say, or it's easy to switch from, say, one plan to another. So your phone costs become more variable in nature. They're easier to increase or decrease depending on how you're using them. Also, as far as evaluating all your options, a few years ago in our family, we decided to make a switch with carriers. It ended up saving us around $800 a year. And was that $800 worth it? And in our experience, it definitely was. And that was specific to our situation, but it was evaluating all of the options that we had available and selecting the best one for our circumstances. I just want to remind you, in terms of utilities, Just like rent, it helps to think in per year terms. And the final couple categories we'll hit is, one is with internet. And maybe you don't value that extra 10 megabytes or 100 megabytes per year. You might be able to save some money that way if that's not something that you value, although that may be something that you do. And changing providers from one internet provider to another, if that's an option in your area, which it is for some and not for others, or even threatening, can also produce decent savings at times, kind of like auto insurance. Another area to consider is cable or satellite. If you're paying, say, $80 a month for cable satellite, that's a total of nearly $1,000 a year that you're spending on cable satellite. I mean, I cord cut well over 10 years ago, and taking the difference between what we spend on entertainment versus the cost of, full cable satellite subscription, it's been, counting all of this up, it's well over $10,000, probably closer to $15,000 in savings. And I'm not like compounding interest with that number, it's just dollars saved. But this is a kind of a cheap shot area because, we don't really watch TV anyway. So that's kind of a cheap shot on my part. But it's something to consider. All right, let's end with a fun activity. It's actually a stressful activity. It's an expenses stress test activity. So your income has been cut in half. And you got 6 months to get it all under control. So we're assuming you're spending 100% of your income today, but we're doing this all after tax dollars, so assume no taxes here. Your income is $50,000, your rent is $18,000, transportation $8,000, food is $6,000, shopping is $10,000, health with your insurance and your expenses is $8,000. Now you need to get all of that down from $50,000 to under $25,000. You have 6 months to do it. And if you are questioning kind of what the details are, just kind of insert yourself in your current situation and kind of your current preferences to try and fill you in on how you could spend that money. What I want you to do is to convert this into monthly expenses over a 6-month window. And you need to put this plan into place. So can you do it? I know you can. Go for it.